In 1870, a 31-year-old man in Cleveland, Ohio, controlled just 4% of America's oil refining capacity. It didn't look like power. It didn't look like dominance. It looked like a modest industrial success in a chaotic new industry. 10 years later, that same man controlled 90%. By 1904, he controlled 91% of oil production, 85% of final sales, and something far more important than oil itself. He controlled the method. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and the system he created didn't die when Standard Oil was broken up in 1911. It didn't collapse. It didn't retreat. It learned. It evolved quietly, legally, structurally, until it became so deeply embedded in modern life that most people stopped seeing it at all. Because the system Rockefeller built is not Standard Oil. Standard Oil was just the prototype. The system is the architecture of modern corporate power. And in 2025, it shapes nearly every part of your daily existence. The gasoline you pump, the drugs you take, the platforms you communicate on, the food you buy, the bank that holds your money. They all follow the same blueprint. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, regulatory capture, tax-advantaged philanthropy. Corporate structures designed not merely to dominate markets, but to make competition structurally impossible. Rockefeller didn't just build an oil empire. He built the operating system of modern capitalism. And once an operating system is installed everywhere, you don't escape it. You live inside it. Amazon uses it. Google uses it. Pfizer uses it. JP Morgan uses it. Different industries. Different centuries. Same logic. Control the supply chain from end to end. Absorb or destroy competitors. Shape the rules that govern your own behavior. And when the government finally intervenes, make sure the pieces left behind are worth more than the whole ever was. That is the Rockefeller blueprint. And to understand why it still governs your life, you have to understand where it came from. John Davidson Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839 in Richford, New York. A rural world defined by scarcity, discipline, and moral absolutes. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who sold fake cancer cures and vanished for months at a time. A con man, charming, ruthless, unapologetic. His mother, Eliza, was the opposite. A devout Baptist, strict, orderly, morally uncompromising. From his father, Rockefeller learned how power actually worked. From his mother, he learned to believe that power, if exercised correctly, was righteous. This fusion would define his entire worldview. He would crush competitors without hesitation, while sincerely believing God had chosen him to bring order to chaos. Not greed, not malice, conviction. To Rockefeller, monopoly wasn't exploitation. It was moral efficiency. In 1859, when oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania, America entered one of the most violent economic booms in its history. Thousands rushed west. Wells were drilled overnight. Fortunes appeared and vanished just as fast. It was capitalism in its rawest form, unregulated, speculative, chaotic. Overproduction collapsed prices. Shortages spiked them again. Boom followed bust, again and again. Most people saw madness. Rockefeller saw a pattern. At 20 years old, working as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, he noticed something crucial. The real money wasn't in drilling. Drilling depended on luck, on hitting oil before the well ran dry. Refining, by contrast, was predictable. Oil had to be refined. Kerosene had to be produced. Someone would always sit between chaos and consumption. That someone, Rockefeller decided, would be him. In 1863, he invested $4,000 into his first oil refinery. Within 2 years, it was the largest refinery in Cleveland. But Cleveland had 30 refineries. Competition was brutal. Margins were razor thin. Most refineries lived one bad month away from collapse. This is where Rockefeller diverged from every other industrialist of his time. He didn't try to win within competition. He decided to end it, not with innovation, not with better products, with structure. This is where the modern corporate era truly begins. Rockefeller understood something that Adam Smith never fully confronted. Markets don't naturally produce fairness. They produce consolidation, but only if someone is willing to be cold enough to execute it. Rockefeller's first weapon was vertical integration. Most refineries did one thing. They bought crude oil. They refined it. They sold kerosene. Rockefeller decided to own everything in between. He bought barrel factories so he wouldn't pay barrel makers. He bought tank cars so he wouldn't rely on rail companies. He built warehouses for storage, distribution networks for sales. Every step that once generated profit for someone else was absorbed into Standard Oil. This wasn't just efficiency, it was exclusion. While competitors paid 25 cents per barrel, Rockefeller made his own for 15. While competitors paid railroads, Rockefeller negotiated secret rebates, getting paid to ship his oil while rivals were charged more. This wasn't free market capitalism. It was engineered asymmetry. Rockefeller could sell kerosene below cost, bleed competitors dry, and still make money. And that's exactly what he did. By 1870, he formalized this machine into the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. At that moment, he controlled just 4% of American refining. But that number was misleading, because the system was already complete. All that remained was scale. What came next would redefine capitalism itself. What Rockefeller built next wasn't growth. It was eradication. Because once vertical integration gave him the lowest costs in the industry, competition stopped being a challenge and became a liability, one that could be removed systematically. This was the second phase of the Rockefeller method, horizontal integration. If vertical integration is about controlling the entire supply chain, horizontal integration is simpler and far more ruthless. It means owning everyone else, or destroying them until ownership is the only rational choice left. In 1872, Rockefeller initiated what historians now call the Cleveland Massacre. The name sounds exaggerated. It isn't. Over a period of just 3 months, Rockefeller approached every oil refinery owner in Cleveland, his home base, his proving ground. To each, he made the same offer: sell to Standard Oil at a fair market price. Join the system. Keep your dignity. Often, even keep your job. Most industrialists would call that generous, but there was a second option. If they refused, Rockefeller unleashed a price war. Standard Oil would slash kerosene prices below cost. Competitors, lacking Rockefeller's vertically integrated advantages, lost money on every gallon they sold. They could not survive long enough to wait him out. This wasn't competition. It was economic suffocation. Refinery owners faced 2 choices: sell now or sell later, bankrupt. Most sold quickly. A few resisted out of pride. None survived. By the end of 1872, Rockefeller controlled 25 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. In 3 months, he went from 4% to 25% of America's refining capacity. This was the moment the modern monopoly was perfected, not through innovation alone, not through scale alone, but through structural inevitability. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a template. Offer acquisition. If rejected, deploy asymmetric pricing, acquire the remains. The same logic would later define railroads, steel, telecommunications, banking, and a century later, technology. Rockefeller didn't just win Cleveland. He proved the method worked everywhere. Throughout the 1870s, Standard Oil expanded across the United States. New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. The same pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Secret railroad rebates, exclusive shipping contracts, predatory pricing, total absorption. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. 90%. That is not a market share. That is command. But Rockefeller understood something else, something even more dangerous. Monopolies don't fail because they're inefficient. They fail because they attract attention. By the late 1880s, public anger was boiling. Journalists called Rockefeller a robber baron. Politicians denounced him as a tyrant. Workers blamed him for destroyed livelihoods. More importantly, the law was catching up. In 1890, the United States passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal attempt to restrain monopolies. On paper, this law should have ended Rockefeller's reign. In practice, it forced him to evolve. This is where Rockefeller's true genius emerged. Not as an industrialist, but as a systems architect. Because Rockefeller didn't fight the law. He reframed reality. In 1882, his lawyers created something entirely new in American business, the corporate trust. At the time, companies couldn't legally operate across state lines the way Standard Oil needed to. But a trust could. Here's how it worked. Individual Standard Oil companies across different states transferred their stock to a small group of trustees, 41 men, all loyal to Rockefeller. The trustees controlled the companies. Rockefeller controlled the trustees. On paper, Standard Oil was no longer a single company. In reality, control had become even more centralized. This was the first large-scale corporate trust in American history. And it changed everything. The trust wasn't a business that refined oil. It was an entity that owned businesses. It didn't compete. It coordinated. This structure solved two problems at once. It allowed Rockefeller to maintain nationwide monopoly control, and it insulated him from direct legal attack. More importantly, it created the ancestor of the modern holding company. The descendants are everywhere. Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, parent companies that own dozens, sometimes hundreds of subsidiaries, each legally separate, all strategically unified. By 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of oil refining and 85% of final sales in the United States. Rockefeller's personal net worth reached $900 million. Adjusted for inflation alone, that's about $25 billion today. But inflation understates the truth. At his peak, in 1913, Rockefeller was worth the equivalent of $400 billion in modern purchasing power. Richer than Bezos, Musk, and Gates combined. The richest individual in modern history. And he didn't achieve this by owning oil. He achieved it by owning structure, but the system he built was now too visible. In 1906, investigative journalist Ida Tarbell published The History of the Standard Oil Company. It exposed everything: secret rebates, predatory pricing, backroom political deals. Public outrage exploded. 5 years later, in 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken up into 34 separate companies. On the surface, this looked like victory, the destruction of a corporate titan, the triumph of democracy over concentrated power. But systems thinkers know something individuals often miss. Breaking a structure does not eliminate its logic. And Rockefeller had planned for this moment, because when Standard Oil was dismantled, Rockefeller still owned shares in every single piece. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Standard Oil of Ohio later became part of BP. The monopoly wasn't destroyed. It was distributed. Before the breakup, Standard Oil shares traded around $600. After the breakup, the combined value of the 34 companies exceeded $2,000 per share. Rockefeller's wealth didn't fall. It tripled. Why? Because forced competition increased efficiency, because regional dominance replaced national scrutiny, and because ownership remained concentrated at the top. The breakup didn't end the system. It optimized it, and over the next century, those fragments quietly merged back together. Exxon and Mobil reunited in 1999. Chevron absorbed multiple Standard Oil descendants. BP consolidated others. The monopoly was broken, then reassembled. But oil was never the real legacy. The real legacy was the method. And by the time Rockefeller died in 1937, that method had already spread far beyond energy. It had become the invisible grammar of capitalism itself. Next, we'll follow that grammar into the modern world and see how Rockefeller's system now governs technology, finance, medicine, and your everyday choices. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, Standard Oil no longer existed as a single entity. But that fact is misleading, because Rockefeller didn't build a company. He built a process, and processes don't die. They replicate. They adapt to new industries, new laws, new technologies, while preserving the same underlying logic. The 20th century didn't reject Rockefeller's system, it normalized it. The trust became the holding company. The rebate became the data advantage. The railroad deal became the platform monopoly. The price war became algorithmic undercutting. Different tools, same extraction. To see this clearly, you don't need secret documents or conspiracy theories. You just need to look at the companies that dominate your life right now. Start with Amazon. Amazon didn't begin as a monopoly. Neither did Standard Oil. It began as a bookstore, small, unthreatening, almost quaint. But Jeff Bezos understood something Rockefeller understood a century earlier. The goal isn't to win a category. The goal is to own the infrastructure beneath all categories. Amazon vertically integrated everything. Warehouses, fulfillment centers, delivery networks, payment systems, and eventually the digital backbone of the internet itself. Amazon Web Services now generates nearly $90 billion a year, more profit than Amazon's retail business. AWS hosts government agencies, banks, startups, and competitors alike. Rockefeller owned refineries, tank cars, and pipelines. Amazon owns logistics, retail, and cloud computing. Same move, different century. Amazon didn't stop there. It pursued horizontal consolidation at scale. Whole Foods, Zappos, Twitch, Ring, MGM Studios, over 100 acquisitions. And when acquisition wasn't possible, Amazon used something Rockefeller never had: perfect information. Third-party sellers are required to share sales data with Amazon. Amazon analyzes that data, identifies profitable products, creates Amazon Basics versions, and promotes them above the originals. This is the Cleveland Massacre. Digitized, legal, algorithmic, devastating. Rockefeller starved competitors through price wars. Amazon starves them through visibility. Now look at Google. Google controls over 90% of global search, more than Standard Oil ever controlled oil. But Google isn't considered a monopoly by many regulators. Why? Because it's free. Rockefeller charged you money. Google charges you data, which is far more valuable. Google's parent company, Alphabet, is a holding company, a direct descendant of the Standard Oil Trust. Google, YouTube, Waymo, DeepMind, Verily, each technically separate, all strategically unified. This structure fragments regulatory oversight while centralizing control, exactly as Rockefeller intended in 1882. Now look at pharmaceuticals. Rockefeller didn't just dominate markets. He shaped the rules governing them. He lobbied for safety standards his refineries could meet, but competitors couldn't. He influenced transportation regulations that favored his logistics advantages. This is called regulatory capture. Today, pharmaceutical companies fund a significant portion of the FDA through user fees. They lobby for patent extensions. They shape clinical trial standards. They influence approval timelines. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, different names, same leverage. Control the regulator, and you control the market. The financial sector followed the same path. J.P. Morgan Chase is not a bank. It is a holding company that owns banks. So are Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. When the 2008 financial crisis exposed systemic risk, regulators tried to impose oversight through Dodd-Frank. But the holding company structure, first perfected by Rockefeller, made it nearly impossible. Which entity do you regulate? The parent? The subsidiaries? Rockefeller solved this puzzle in the 19th century. Banks copied the solution 100 years later. But Rockefeller's most subtle and most misunderstood innovation wasn't oil, trusts, or monopolies. It was philanthropy. In 1913, Rockefeller created the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial gift of $250 million, over $7 billion today. On the surface, this looked like generosity, and parts of it were. But structurally, it accomplished three things. First, it protected Rockefeller's wealth from estate taxes. Second, it allowed him to shape what institutions studied, taught, and prioritized. Third, it transformed his public image. The monopolist became a benefactor. The robber baron became a visionary. The foundation funded public health initiatives, medical research, and universities. Johns Hopkins, the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University. It also reshaped American medicine by funding institutions that emphasized pharmaceutical interventions and laboratory-based research. It marginalized holistic and preventive approaches. This isn't speculation. It's documented policy. The modern pharmaceutical model emerged from funding incentives, not purely from scientific inevitability. And the companies that profited most from that model, many descended from Standard Oil's chemical divisions. Today, this model is everywhere. The Gates Foundation, the Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative, the Bezos Earth Fund, billions in tax-advantaged assets, massive influence over global health, education, and policy. These foundations don't just give money. They direct attention. Rockefeller invented this model. Modern billionaires perfected it. The Rockefeller family itself never disappeared. David Rockefeller, John D's grandson, led Chase Manhattan Bank, founded the Trilateral Commission, and shaped global finance for half a century. The family's wealth, estimated around $11 billion today, is spread across trusts and foundations that continue to influence policy, research, and governance. But the most important part of the Rockefeller system isn't who controls it. It's how invisible it has become. You don't feel coerced. You feel served. You buy gasoline from Exxon or Chevron, descendants of Standard Oil. You shop on Amazon, built on Rockefeller's integration logic. You search on Google, structured like the Standard Oil Trust. You take medicine shaped by research incentives Rockefeller pioneered. You bank through institutions built on his holding company architecture. Every step feels like choice. But structurally, the paths all lead to the same place. This is what makes the system so powerful. It doesn't need enforcement. It creates inevitability. And once a system becomes inevitable, resistance feels impractical, even irrational. In the final part, we'll break down exactly how this system extracts wealth from you, why it concentrates power upward, and what, if anything, can be done when escape is no longer an option. The most effective systems don't announce themselves. They don't demand obedience. They don't require force. They simply arrange reality so that every reasonable choice leads in the same direction. This is Rockefeller's final achievement. Not monopoly by decree, but monopoly by design. To understand how the system extracts wealth from you, you have to stop thinking in terms of individual companies and start thinking in terms of flows. Money doesn't disappear, it moves. And in the Rockefeller system, it moves upward, slowly, legally, invisibly. Let's start with something simple. Gasoline. You need it to work, to live, to function in modern society. You believe you have options. Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell. But these are not true competitors in the classical sense. They are an oligopoly, a small group of dominant firms whose pricing moves in coordination, not conspiracy, but structure. They don't need to collude explicitly. They share cost structures. They share supply constraints. They share regulatory environments. Rockefeller understood this perfectly. Once competition is reduced to a few giants, price becomes stable, predictable, and profitable. You're not choosing. You're selecting between branches of the same tree. Now look at retail. Amazon dominates through vertical integration. Walmart and Target are forced to match its scale, logistics, and pricing, or disappear. This isn't because Amazon is morally superior or more innovative. It's because scale compounds. Once infrastructure is built, it becomes a moat. Rockefeller's pipelines became Amazon's fulfillment centers. Barriers to entry rise. Alternatives shrink. Choice becomes symbolic. Now consider information. Google controls over 90% of search. That's higher than Standard Oil's peak. But Google avoids the monopoly label because you don't pay with money. You pay with attention, with data, with behavioral patterns. This is extraction without transaction. Rockefeller would have admired it. A monopoly so complete that users don't even perceive themselves as customers. Then there's social connection. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, 3 billion users. Different apps, same owner. Horizontal consolidation, perfected. You're not choosing platforms. You're choosing which doorway into the same building to walk through. Healthcare follows the same logic. Doctors are trained in a system shaped by funding priorities set over a century ago. Treatment protocols align with pharmaceutical incentives. Insurance reimbursement structures reward intervention over prevention. This doesn't require malice. It requires alignment. And alignment is what the Rockefeller system excels at creating. Now add it up. The average American spends roughly $4,000 a year on gasoline, $3,000 on Amazon and large-scale retail, $5,000 on healthcare beyond insurance, $4,000 on technology, internet, and platforms. That's over $16,000 per year flowing into companies operating on Rockefeller's model. Over a lifetime, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, not circulating through small businesses or local competition, but concentrating upward into consolidated corporate structures. This is extraction without chains. You are not forced. You are funneled. And this is why escape feels impossible. You could refuse gasoline, but then you can't work. You could avoid Amazon, but convenience and pricing punish you. You could stop using Google, but alternatives lack scale. You could reject pharmaceutical medicine, but licensing, insurance, and cultural norms block the path. The system doesn't prohibit alternatives. It starves them. This is Rockefeller's most enduring insight. You don't need to ban competition. You just need to make it uneconomic. This is why Rockefeller outlived Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Morgan. Not physically, but structurally. Carnegie built steel mills. When he died, U.S. Steel remained, but his control faded. Vanderbilt built railroads. They fragmented after him. J.P. Morgan built financial empires. They diluted with time. But Rockefeller built a system. And systems don't depend on personalities. They survive leadership changes, political shifts, even legal attacks. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, but vertical integration spread everywhere. Trusts became holding companies. Regulatory capture became lobbying. Philanthropy became institutional influence. Every component was absorbed into law, policy, and culture. By the time Rockefeller died in 1937, the system was already stronger without him, because it no longer needed him. Now here's the uncomfortable truth most critiques avoid. The system works. It is efficient. Before Standard Oil, kerosene cost 58 cents per gallon. After Rockefeller's consolidation, it dropped to 8 cents, an 86% reduction. Amazon delivers goods in days. Google answers questions in seconds. Pharmaceutical companies produce life-saving drugs at scale. Efficiency is real. Rockefeller understood this. Competition is a sin, he said, not out of arrogance, but belief. Competition duplicates effort. It wastes capital. It introduces instability. Consolidation, in his worldview, was righteous. It served consumers through lower prices while concentrating control at the top. And this is the trade-off the system offers you. Cheap goods, fast services, reliable infrastructure, in exchange for upward wealth concentration. Both are true. The problem isn't that the system fails. The problem is that it succeeds unevenly. So what are your options? There are only three. First, accept it. Recognize consolidation as the natural endpoint of advanced capitalism. Use the efficiencies. Stop expecting fairness. Second, resist it. Support antitrust enforcement. Buy from smaller businesses even when it costs more. Vote for regulation that prioritizes competition over efficiency. This path is morally coherent, but exhausting. Third, understand it. If you cannot escape the system, position yourself within it. This is what Rockefeller did. He didn't buy kerosene. He owned Standard Oil. If wealth flows upward through these structures, owning part of them changes your position from extracted to participant. This isn't moral endorsement, it's pattern recognition. And patterns matter more than intentions. In the final part, we'll return to Rockefeller himself, his worldview, his final years, and why the system he created may already be approaching its next evolutionary phase. Because systems don't last forever. They only last until something more efficient replaces them. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937 at the age of 97. He lived long enough to see Standard Oil declared illegal. He lived long enough to see it broken into pieces, and he lived long enough to see something far more important. The system survived. Not as a company, not as a brand, but as a permanent feature of modern economic life. Most industrialists build empires that decay after they're gone. Rockefeller built something rarer. He built a logic. Andrew Carnegie built steel mills. When he died, U.S. Steel remained, but Carnegie's personal dominance faded. Cornelius Vanderbilt built railroads. After his death, they fragmented. J.P. Morgan built financial power. When he died, it dispersed among partners and institutions. Rockefeller built a system, and systems don't require heirs. They reproduce themselves. By the mid-20th century, Rockefeller's ideas were no longer controversial. They were institutionalized. Vertical integration became standard business practice. Holding companies became normal corporate structure. Lobbying replaced direct political influence. Foundations replaced personal patronage. What once looked like monopoly abuse became best practice. Corporate law absorbed it. Tax codes optimized for it. Regulators learned to work within it. And once something is embedded at that level, removing it becomes nearly impossible. This is why every major industry today converges toward the same shape. 3 to 5 dominant players, high barriers to entry, minimal true competition, energy, technology, banking, pharmaceuticals, media, different sectors, same end state. This isn't coordination, it's gravity. Markets consolidate because consolidation is efficient. And efficiency, once proven, spreads everywhere. Rockefeller understood this earlier than anyone else. That's why his most famous quote is often misunderstood. Competition is a sin. Most people hear greed. Rockefeller meant waste. In his worldview, competition duplicated infrastructure, fragmented capital, and raised costs. Consolidation created order, and order, to him, was moral. That belief wasn't unique to Rockefeller. It was shared by many progressive-era reformers who paradoxically supported both regulation and consolidation, believing large, stable corporations were easier to regulate than chaotic markets. That compromise still defines capitalism today. The system delivers cheap energy, fast logistics, instant information, advanced medicine, but it concentrates power relentlessly. This is the price, and it's not evenly distributed. A small number of corporations accumulate unprecedented wealth. A small number of individuals sit atop those structures. Everyone else participates as consumers and labor, not trapped, but constrained. This is why escape feels impossible. Not because there's a conspiracy, but because the incentives align too perfectly. And this brings us to the final, uncomfortable truth. The Rockefeller system is not ending. It's mutating. Artificial intelligence will intensify vertical integration. Data will replace capital as the primary moat. Platforms will own not just distribution, but prediction. The same logic applied to new tools. The same extraction, executed more subtly. If there is a lesson in Rockefeller's life, it isn't moral outrage. It's clarity. He saw where capitalism was heading and moved there first. He didn't fight the system. He designed it. So, what does that mean for you? It means understanding matters more than outrage. It means recognizing patterns before they fully solidify. It means knowing that systems reward those who align with them and punish those who pretend they don't exist. You don't have to admire Rockefeller. You don't have to defend him, but you do have to recognize his work, because you live inside it. Every time you buy fuel, every time you click a search result, every time you order online, every time you interact with modern finance or medicine, the Rockefeller system isn't hidden, it's normalized. And normalization is the final stage of power. Standard Oil is gone, but the method is eternal. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, corporate trusts, regulatory capture, philanthropic influence. This is the modern economy, and John D. Rockefeller was its architect. You cannot escape the system he created. But once you see it clearly, you stop mistaking inevitability for accident. And that awareness, more than resistance, more than compliance, is the first step toward agency. Welcome to Rockefeller's world. There's a moment in every well-designed system when it stops feeling imposed and starts feeling natural. That moment is the system's greatest victory, because once people stop questioning structure, power no longer needs to defend itself. This is where the Rockefeller system exists today. Not enforced, not hidden, simply assumed. You wake up inside it. You earn money inside it. You spend money inside it. You save, borrow, invest, heal, communicate, and consume inside it. And because it delivers convenience, speed, and stability, it feels rational to accept it. That was always the point. Rockefeller never wanted rebellion. He wanted normalization. He understood something deeper than profit. People don't resist what feels inevitable. They adapt to it. This is why the most dangerous systems don't look oppressive. They look efficient. When Standard Oil lowered kerosene prices by 86%, working families benefited. When Amazon delivers in 2 days, consumers benefit. When Google provides instant answers, users benefit. Efficiency buys consent, and consent eliminates resistance. That's why antitrust enforcement has always struggled. Breaking companies is easy. Breaking logic is almost impossible. Every time regulators dismantle a dominant firm, the market recreates the same structure, because the incentives that produced it remain intact. This is why Standard Oil's breakup didn't end consolidation. It refined it. This is why the Great Depression led to regulation, but not deconsolidation. This is why the 2008 financial crisis produced oversight, but left banks larger than before. This is why today's tech antitrust cases feel symbolic rather than transformative. The system has already won the argument. It frames consolidation as stability, scale as safety, efficiency as virtue. And in many ways, it's right. But here is the distinction Rockefeller understood, and most people still miss. A system can be functional and extractive at the same time. Those two conditions are not opposites. They are partners. The Rockefeller system works precisely because it concentrates value upward while distributing enough benefit downward to prevent revolt. That balance is not accidental. It is calibrated, and once calibrated, it becomes self-reinforcing. Children are educated inside it. Professionals are trained inside it. Politicians are funded inside it. Regulators are recruited from inside it. Eventually, there is no outside reference point left, only variations within the same structure. That is when power becomes cultural instead of coercive. This is why Rockefeller outlasted every robber baron of his era, not because he was richer, but because he was structural. When he said, "Competition is a sin," he wasn't talking about morality in the modern sense. He was talking about inefficiency. From his perspective, competition wasted resources, duplicated infrastructure, and destabilized markets. Consolidation brought order. Order brought predictability. Predictability brought control. And control, once embedded into law and habit, becomes invisible. This is the world you live in now. A world where 3 to 5 firms dominate every industry, where innovation happens inside platforms, not outside them, where disruption is usually acquisition in disguise, where philanthropy shapes policy more effectively than elections, where wealth concentration is framed as a byproduct, not a design feature. And here's the part that matters most. Seeing the system doesn't destroy it, but it does change your relationship to it. When you stop believing outcomes are random, you stop blaming yourself for structural results. When you recognize patterns, you stop chasing illusions. When you understand where power flows, you stop confusing participation with control. This is why understanding the system is not academic. It's survival. Rockefeller didn't leave behind a villain to defeat. He left behind a framework to recognize. And frameworks, once seen clearly, lose their mystique. You may still live inside the system, but you no longer mistake it for nature. That awareness doesn't free you from gravity, but it does teach you how to move within it. John D. Rockefeller created a system you cannot escape, not because it is cruel, but because it is efficient. And efficiency, once proven, is eternal, until something even more efficient replaces it. The question is not whether the Rockefeller system will end. Every system eventually does. The question is whether you will recognize the next one before it finishes building itself around you. Because history doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And once you learn the rhythm, you hear it everywhere. Every system believes it is permanent. That belief is always wrong. But systems don't collapse all at once. They don't announce their end. They don't disappear in fire and rubble. They fade into something else. Rockefeller's system is no exception. What he built was perfectly suited for the industrial age. For oil, railroads, steel, manufacturing, mass production, centralized capital, centralized logistics, centralized control. It was the ideal architecture for a world powered by physical infrastructure. But history moves. And when technology shifts, systems mutate. Today, we are watching the Rockefeller system stretch into a new shape. Oil is no longer the ultimate choke point. Data is. Pipelines are being replaced by platforms, refineries by algorithms, railroads by networks. The logic, however, remains intact. Vertical integration becomes stack ownership. Hardware, software, cloud, AI models, owned end-to-end. Horizontal consolidation becomes ecosystem dominance. Buy competitors, absorb talent, control standards. Regulatory capture becomes complexity. Systems so technical that only insiders can regulate them. Philanthropy becomes narrative control. Funding research, shaping ethics, defining what questions are even allowed to be asked. This is not the end of the Rockefeller system. It is its next version. And just like before, most people won't notice the transition while it's happening. Because the system doesn't arrive as oppression. It arrives as progress. Faster tools, smarter services, more convenience, less friction. That's how power always introduces itself. Rockefeller didn't dominate by denying people oil. He dominated by making it cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable, while quietly removing every alternative. Today's platforms do the same. They don't ban competition. They make it irrelevant. And this is why the most important takeaway from Rockefeller's life is not outrage. It's pattern recognition. He showed us the end state of unchecked efficiency. He showed us how markets naturally collapse into control. He showed us that once a system proves it works, morality becomes secondary. Not because people are evil, but because incentives are stronger than intentions. So when you look at the modern world and feel something is off, when wealth concentrates faster than productivity, when choice feels abundant but outcomes feel fixed, when innovation seems constant but power never moves, you're not imagining it. You're recognizing a structure, the same one Rockefeller finalized more than a century ago. He didn't predict the future. He built the template the future would reuse. And once you see that template, you see it everywhere. In mergers, in platforms, in regulations, in philanthropy. In the quiet assumption that this is simply how the world works. But history teaches us one final lesson. No system lasts forever. Feudalism fell. Mercantilism faded. Industrial monopolies transformed. The Rockefeller system will eventually give way to something else. The only question is whether people will recognize the transition or mistake it once again for inevitability. John D. Rockefeller created a system you cannot escape, not because you are powerless, but because the system is structural, not personal, and structures don't care what you believe. They only care how you move. Understanding that doesn't free you from the system, but it does give you the one thing Rockefeller valued above all else: clarity. And in a world shaped by invisible systems, clarity is the rarest form of power. There is one final illusion the Rockefeller system depends on. The illusion that this is simply the way things are. That concentration is natural. That power inevitably rises upward. That individuals are too small to matter against structures this large. Rockefeller himself would have rejected that idea, not because he believed in equality, but because he believed in agency. He didn't stumble into dominance. He recognized a pattern before others did, and moved decisively while the rest were still debating morality. That is the uncomfortable part of his legacy. Rockefeller was not powerful because he was ruthless alone. He was powerful because he understood systems earlier than everyone else. He saw that capitalism does not reward fairness. It rewards structure. He saw that laws follow power, not the other way around. That efficiency becomes justification. That once a model works, it spreads regardless of who benefits. And he acted accordingly. This is why the Rockefeller system feels impossible to escape. Not because you are weak, but because the system is aligned. Legally, culturally, economically. You are taught to compete as an individual inside a world that rewards consolidation at scale. That mismatch is the real trap. The system doesn't need you to fail. It only needs you to play by rules that cannot produce the outcomes you expect. This is why frustration is everywhere. People work harder than ever, produce more than ever, access more technology than ever, yet feel further behind. That's not personal failure. That's structural extraction. Rockefeller understood extraction doesn't require force. It requires architecture. Design the flow of money. Design the flow of information. Design the flow of regulation. Then let human behavior do the rest. This is why outrage alone never works. You cannot shout a system into collapsing. You cannot boycott an architecture you live inside. The only real counter to a system is understanding. Not understanding as trivia, understanding as orientation. Once you see how consolidation forms, you stop mistaking monopolies for accidents. Once you see how regulation is shaped, you stop believing power fears oversight. Once you see how philanthropy functions, you stop confusing generosity with neutrality. This doesn't mean the system disappears. It means you stop being blind to it. Rockefeller never feared critics. He feared competitors who understood structure as well as he did. That is the difference between rebellion and threat. Rebellion reacts, threat replaces. And history shows us something important. Every dominant system is eventually displaced, not by moral arguments, but by a more efficient structure. The Rockefeller system replaced chaotic competition. Whatever comes next will replace consolidation, not because it is fairer, but because it will be more effective at organizing power. The danger is not that this next system will arrive. The danger is that most people won't recognize it until it is already normalized, just as Rockefeller's system is now. John D. Rockefeller didn't just shape oil. He shaped how power organizes itself in modern society. That is why his influence feels everywhere and nowhere at the same time. You cannot escape the Rockefeller system. But once you understand it, you stop mistaking structure for destiny. And that shift, from confusion to clarity, is the only leverage ordinary people have ever had against extraordinary systems. The system thrives on invisibility. Understanding makes it visible. And visibility, even without control, changes everything. There's a reason stories like this feel unsettling. Not because they reveal a hidden villain, but because they reveal a mirror. Rockefeller's system doesn't operate in secret rooms or smoke-filled back offices anymore. It operates in daylight, inside contracts, platforms, institutions, and habits. That's what maturity looks like for power. At its peak, Standard Oil was visible enough to be attacked. Today's system is quieter. It doesn't announce dominance. It measures it. Market share, data ownership, network effects, regulatory complexity. Power no longer needs to conquer. It just needs to scale. And this is why Rockefeller still matters, not as a historical figure, but as a diagnostic tool. Once you understand his method, you start seeing patterns that were always there. Why every industry ends up with 3 or 4 giants. Why disruption usually ends in acquisition. Why regulation grows thicker but power grows more concentrated. Why philanthropy increasingly shapes policy faster than elections. None of this is accidental. It is the natural outcome of a system optimized for efficiency above all else. Rockefeller didn't invent greed. He systematized concentration. And concentration, once embedded, becomes self-reinforcing. The bigger you are, the cheaper you operate. The cheaper you operate, the more market you absorb. The more market you absorb, the more influence you gain over rules. The more influence you gain, the harder it becomes to challenge you. This loop doesn't need villains. It only needs incentives. That's why the Rockefeller system survived antitrust laws, wars, depressions, and technological revolutions. It adapted. It learned to fragment legally while consolidating economically. It learned to decentralize branding while centralizing control. It learned to turn public outrage into manageable compliance. Most importantly, it learned how to disappear into normal life. That is the final stage of any successful system. When people stop asking where it came from, when they stop imagining alternatives, when they start calling structure reality. And this is why understanding matters more than ever. Not because knowledge magically frees you, but because ignorance guarantees you remain predictable. Rockefeller succeeded because he understood where capitalism was heading before others did. He didn't resist the system. He arrived early and built it to his advantage. That doesn't mean you can repeat his success, but it does mean you can stop misunderstanding the terrain you're standing on. You stop thinking effort alone determines outcomes. You stop assuming competition is fair by default. You stop confusing abundance of choice with diversity of power. You begin to see leverage, not the kind sold in motivational books, but the quiet leverage of alignment, understanding where value flows, understanding which structures endure, understanding why some battles are symbolic and others are existential. This is not cynicism. It's orientation. Rockefeller's world didn't end with oil. It expanded into everything. Technology didn't disrupt his system. It accelerated it. Finance didn't replace his model. It refined it. Philanthropy didn't soften his legacy. It protected it. And now, in the age of AI, platforms, and predictive systems, the same logic is being written into code. The next Rockefeller system will not be built on refineries or pipelines. It will be built on infrastructure you can't see, owned by companies you interact with constantly, regulated by agencies struggling to understand them. The pattern is repeating. Not exactly, but close enough to recognize. And recognition is the point, because history doesn't reward outrage. It rewards comprehension. John D. Rockefeller created a system you cannot escape, not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was structurally correct. He understood that once efficiency proves itself, it becomes law. Once law embeds it, it becomes culture. Once culture accepts it, it becomes invisible. That is how systems win. And that is why this story isn't really about Rockefeller. It's about you. And whether you see the architecture shaping your choices or mistake it for the natural order of things. You live inside the Rockefeller system, but now at least you know its name. And knowing the system doesn't free you from it, but it changes how you move. Welcome to the system. Every system survives because most people never make a conscious choice about it. They inherit it. They adapt to it. They normalize it. Rockefeller counted on that. not apathy, momentum. The system doesn't need your loyalty. It only needs your participation. Work, consume, save, invest, comply. Do this long enough and the architecture does the rest. This is why the Rockefeller system doesn't feel like control. It feels like responsibility. You're told success is personal, failure is personal, risk is personal, but structure is never mentioned. That omission is the system's greatest protection, because once outcomes are framed as individual morality, power no longer has to explain itself. Rockefeller understood this intuitively. He didn't want people to feel trapped. He wanted them to feel accountable, inside rules he designed. That is far more effective. And this is where the story quietly turns back toward you. Not to inspire rebellion, not to sell hope, but to clarify the only real choice that ever exists inside large systems. You can't opt out completely. You can't dismantle it alone. You can't outrun structure with effort. But you can choose awareness over illusion. Most people never do. They chase narratives that promise escape while reinforcing participation. They confuse motion with progress. They mistake volatility for opportunity. Rockefeller never did. He ignored noise and watched flows. Money flows, energy flows, information flows, power flows. And systems are simply the channels that guide them. Once you understand the channels, you stop asking why the river moves the way it does. You start asking where it leads. That shift doesn't make you powerful. It makes you harder to mislead. And in a world built on invisible architecture, that alone is rare. The Rockefeller system will not end tomorrow. It may not end in your lifetime, but like every system before it, it will eventually be replaced by something more efficient. When that happens, most people will call it progress. A few will recognize it as transition, and an even smaller few will understand it early enough to choose how they align with it. Rockefeller didn't win because he controlled oil. He won because he understood structure before it became obvious. That advantage still exists. Not to dominate, not to exploit, but to navigate without illusion. This is the quiet choice. To see the system, to name it, to stop mistaking it for nature. You still live inside it, but now you don't live blindly. And in every era shaped by systems larger than individuals, that awareness is the closest thing to freedom history has ever allowed.